Back a year ago.
This episode of the Beer Bound Podcast is brought to you by Rolling Hops Beer Tours.
Hey everybody, Garrett here from Rolling Hops, as always joined with my partner,
Andy.
We're here to tell you guys about our virtual craft beer tour offering. With what's going on in the world, unfortunately, we haven't been able to run our historical craft walking beer tour, so we've pivoted to taking the virtual experience of craft beer directly to you guys. Wonderful for team building events, corporate events, even just a night out or in, for that matter, with your friends and family. And we're doing this online.
Have any questions about the beer tours or want us to tailor make an event for you? Just shoot us an email or send us a message on any form of social media. Rolling Hops, you can find us everywhere.
RollingHopsBeerTours.com is where you can get a hold of us, and we'll see you guys soon.
Cheers. Welcome everyone to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. We are very excited to be joined by Jereme Zimmerman, author of Make Mead Like a Viking and Brew Beer Like a Yeti. Jereme was born and raised on Twin Meadows goat farm in northern Kentucky, where he was also homeschooled along with his 4 siblings. He received his bachelor's in English from Berea College in Berea, Kentucky, and then proceeded to head to the Pacific Northwest. During this period, he discovered his love for fermentation and craft beer through travels in Europe and throughout Washington, Oregon, Colorado, British Columbia, and the Northwest and Southwest of the United States in general, much on his bicycle or his 1970 Volkswagen bus, Alice. Very cool. He then moved back to Berea, Kentucky, where he pursued fermentation, mead making, beer brewing, and his writing career in earnest. So on top of his 2 principal works that we'll talk about today, Jereme has also been published in various magazines and websites and travels nationwide to events such as the Mother Earth News Fair to present on topics such as fermentation, natural and holistic homebrewing, modern homesteading, and sustainable living. He is an avid fermenter and researches extensively into traditional fermentation practices in order to revive lost food arts and to educate people on how to preserve food using traditional, natural, and healing ingredients and techniques. Wow. We're looking forward to learning more about Jereme and his expertise in beer, mead, and fermentation. So Jereme, let's get into it. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everybody else out there is doing well.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Maybe on top of that little biography and that introduction, Jereme, can you elaborate a little bit on yourself, your love and connection to beer, to fermentation, to mead, to historic practices? Give us a bit more context on you.
I'm happy to do that. That could be a very long story. I'll try to keep it short. Cut me off if I continue on for too long. But the essence of it is, a lot of it has to do with how I grew up and how I was raised. As you mentioned, I was raised on a Kentucky goat farm. My parents raised and bred and sold and ate and drank milk from all kinds of animals, but goats, Nubian goats specifically, is what my mom decided to focus on. She still sells and breeds Nubian goats 30, 40 years later, something like that. But yeah, so we lived on about 40 acres. We had an old farmhouse that literally had holes in the roof and the walls and the floor and everything else when we moved in when I was about 1. And my dad, he enjoyed foraging. He made his own wine, just pretty much from stuff he grew or foraged on his land because of an interest in that and because they just didn't have much money. He was an English teacher. So fast forward, I was homeschooled up until high school, went to high school up in Northern Kentucky. As you mentioned, I went to Berea College. That's where I learned to drink beer. Wasn't always the best beer, but I started to discover imports at the time and decided to move off to the Pacific Northwest. Lived in Seattle and up north in Bellingham, Washington for about 8 years. So during all that period, I enjoyed a lot of the early craft beers, Deschutes Brewery, Pyramid, a lot of the classics. Spent a little time in British Columbia, Canada, because I lived across the border. My first wife and I, Jennifer, bought a VW bus. We traveled the Southwest and Northwest, all over the place. Biked quite a bit. So yeah, during all that, I've always been kind of a DIY, do things myself, try to be as cheap as possible. So I picked up my first beer kit in Seattle, and then in Washington, I brewed just basic extract beer, just your basic brew kit you buy from a beer store. Did a few batches like that. Between then and moving back to Kentucky to be closer to my family, I started getting more interested in historical brewing, kind of herbal, natural brewing, whatever you want to call it. Just because I enjoyed brewing with the beer kits, but I always like cooking from scratch as much as possible. And I felt like there was more I could do than just, use these extract kits. So during that period, I started also getting into making mead, honey-based ferments, and also fermenting sauerkraut and the different types of food. And then, so yeah, it all kind of just organically moved together like that. And in that process of, mead was really what got me into going back to the very basics: ferment honey and water, put a few other things in with it. And, you can make a pretty simple beverage that way, ferment it. And then I started learning about like Nordic brewing traditions that are starting to especially come back now, thanks to the work of, books like Traditional Farmhouse Brewing by Lars Marius Garshol, Mika Leitinen, a Finnish beer writer. I started researching them and I've gotten to know them since. And so then I delved into the world of brewing beer traditionally, with or without hops, with different herbs. I learned about malting, how you can theoretically grow and malt your own grain, but like people used to do historically, but there's a bit of a challenge to just doing enough of that at home to brew beer with. So basically I just experimented a lot, made some really good stuff, made some questionable stuff, but learned a lot about the history and the process behind it. And so, yeah, it kind of all just coalesced into these different things. And what led to my books was, I've always been a writer. Being an English major, I always managed to find some kind of freelance writing or other ways to make a living while, basically being a mountain biking bum the rest of the time. So I was looking into how, finding things to write about that I truly enjoyed. And as I was learning about fermentation, I got connected with events like the Mother Earth News Fair, where I did basically my first presentation on mead in Asheville, North Carolina. They became interested, publishers became interested. My first book, Make Mead Like a Viking, came out, I think about 2015, but it was kind of just a bunch of things that kind of luckily coalesced together. My interests happened to combine with the time period when Vikings and mead were suddenly becoming big things, and the publisher that I went with, Chelsea Green, I think they saw that and kind of did some research on those keywords, and they're like, yeah, you're Make Mead Like a Viking, we're going to do that. And my second book, Brew Beer Like a Yeti, I initially started blogging on a website that doesn't exist anymore. It was a startup, eartheneer.com, and I just gave myself the pseudonym, Redheaded Yeti. I usually had more of a beard. That's red speckled with white now. My hair is kind of reddish. It used to be a lot more red. At the time, it was a big bushy beard, and a friend jokingly called me the Yeti. And so it stuck. It went with that. My second book went much beyond Viking Scandinavian. So I went into all different types of traditional beer brewing. So the publisher decided to call that one Brew Beer Like a Yeti. and just so we could kind of have the couldn't really do brew beer like a Viking, but at least they're pretty much companion volumes.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one honestly is not quite twice as big, but it's definitely thicker than the first, because basically as I was researching Mead, I found a ton of stuff on beer and kept having to put it aside. So about a year and a half, 2 years after the first book came out, the publishers asked if I wanted to do something else. And so, well, I've kind of already got this other one in the works, and that's how that one came about. So because of the books and everything else, I've done a fair bit of traveling. The Mother Earth News Fairs, I have done several of. They've kind of been my big thing. That's gotten me going, but I've done a lot of smaller workshops. Actually traveled to London and Manchester, England, 2019. I did a fair bit of traveling, and then 2020 hit, and since then I've done quite a few Zoom talks. And I started doing a little more traveling, but not as much as I used to.
Right. Jereme, can you break it down very simplistically, the differences both in history as well as in a current modern context, the difference between beer and mead, both in its historic creation and what it's led up to until now?
Yeah, I'll start with actually the more modern, very different, modern definition of the two, simply because it's a lot simpler than what it really was in the past. So mead is pretty basic. At its core, it is really just honey, water, and yeast. Of course, you can add all kinds of things to it, fruits, herbs, spices. Just like wine, you're going to add a few little things like tannins and nutrients, things that help kind of balance the flavor. So mead is honey-based. Beer is primarily grain-based, so malted grains, which we could do a whole discussion on what malted grains are. Hopefully people are at least familiar with what that means. But yeah, the definition historically blurred, and even now it can be a little blurred. So you can have honey beers, which, basically a honey beer is just a beer with a bit of honey in it. There's also braggot, which is a bunch of malt and a bunch of honey, this big old barley wine kind of a beer. A lot of different combinations. And that kind of goes back into what all this was historically. So, I can make mead like a Viking, for example. When I started researching that, specifically trying to look into how the Vikings did it, but I also went back to like Neolithic times. And basically what I discovered was that people just once they figured out that they could take any kind of a sugar, get some yeast in it somehow, get it fermenting, get it kind of boozy and alcoholic, they just mixed whatever they could in. So one of my early sources, and I still follow him a lot, is Dr. Patrick McGovern. I'm also known as the Indiana Jones of beer. So from the University of Pennsylvania, I believe, but he did a lot of historical research, and basically what he came up with was he called it a grog. So like early Bronze Age ales and even earlier on would be just a mix of cereal grains, honey, fruit, a lot of different herbs. I mean, there would be as many as 60 or 70 different herbs when they did microbiological analysis. So, I like to say, back then people just mixed together whatever they could to make a boozy beverage. And over time, it's separated into different distinctions, wine and cider and all of that. So, and if you look into beer historically, that gets really convoluted too, because it wasn't necessarily just malted grains. You see 18th century, 17th century recipes for like a gallon of batch of beer you can make at home that was just made with basically cane sugar and ginger and some herbs. So I've got some recipes in Beer Like a Yeti for beer that has no actual grains in it. But historically, that's what it was called. And then if you want to go even geekier into it, there's the difference between beer and ale. So essentially now I would just look at it as beer would be more like a lager. So it's cold fermented, bottom fermenting yeast. Ale is, top fermenting yeast, warm fermented. But yeah, so there are modern distinctions, and then historically it's really blurred. And one thing I found with mead specifically was looking into the etymology of the word. It shows up a lot in like Beowulf and medieval texts and Icelandic texts, Icelandic sagas. But if you look into the translations, sometimes the word is something like Ealu, probably not saying it right, but like Ealu. So the word for mead and the word for ale could be used just kind of whenever they felt like it. So when they were talking about, Beowulf drinking a bunch of mead, he could very well have been drinking a bunch of ale or a mixture of ale and mead. The main thing is once we started commercializing and selling it, that was when we really had to start distinguishing between different styles. And people like to know what they're drinking. So it helps to give it a name.
That's true. Imagine today's day and age when everyone's fighting over what different styles of beer actually mean and what they're actually supposed to be. Could imagine they grabbing a half a dozen beers from back in the times you're discussing. They go nuts.
Yeah, but even that is changing a little bit now. I mean, there are a lot of breweries that are doing a lot of that historical type stuff that it's kind of a beer, it's kind of a wine. They're trying some, they're doing wild fermentation. And yeah, we do definitely still have your style geeks, but even within certain styles, like an IPA, how many hops does it take to make it an IPA?
Yeah.
Good IPAs really originate from, British sending, casks of beer to India. Anyway, yeah, so there's all kinds of geeky stuff you can get into historically, but yeah, and a lot of it too, especially in the United States, is the just to be able to sell something. Like if a winery wants to make a mead, there's all this licensing and stuff, and there has to be a certain percentage of a certain type of fermentable beverage. So there's reasons for it, but sometimes I think it gets a little silly.
That's true, right? Just call it what you think it is, anyways. But I guess they can't really have people going around saying they sell mead and it's a 7% IPA type thing. It might be crossing some lines there.
Yeah, there does need to be some kind of a distinction, for sure.
Why did mead not become more of an international alcoholic beverage? Why did beer just spread so much more rapidly and is so much more well known in the world today? Why did mead not take off? Yeah, I mean, that's another one of those things that is changing. I mean, there's definitely a big growing craft mead movement, but it may get somewhere close to where craft beer is, but I don't think it can ever get, craft beer is just enormous, and beer itself always has been. It's hard for me to say for sure exactly why that is, but I definitely have some ideas. When I first started researching mead and the history of mead, one reason there was so much more in the beer book is there just wasn't a whole lot about mead, and a lot of it was conjecture. It was way back in the day as big, if not bigger than beer, although beer has always been, as soon as we figured out how to grow and malt grains and kind of turn that into beer, archaeologists have discovered that, pretty much Neolithic peoples were brewing beer, but also mead. So that, in a way, I kind of like to think of it as beer is sort of a working person's drink. Not that mead isn't necessarily, but it's always had that association with, people historically would just brew it. They do small beers, low alcohol beers to drink as table beers with their dinner, or even, coming in from the fields. Whole families would drink table beers. And even way back into, talking about Viking times and whatnot, where again, some of it could have been mead. Beer itself was, and in Anglo-Saxon times, Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland, even Ethiopia, different parts of Africa, beer is pretty much taken over everywhere. I mean, grains grow pretty much everywhere. Sake is a type of beer, for example, because rice is a type of grain. So every culture has had beer, pretty much. And every culture has had mead that has access to honey.
but it just never quite took off in the same way that beer has. So it's hard to put exactly why that is. Part of it is you can grow a lot of grains and malt a lot of grains into beer in practically any climate. Some grains do better in other climates. Honey, bees are practically everywhere, but for a long time when people wanted to get honey, they would basically have to knock a hive down out of a tree, or figure out ways to build their own rustic kind of hives out of just a hollowed out log. So it was a lot harder to get enough honey to really turn into mead, and a lot of that honey they'd be using for food, for sweetening food or just whatever. And I guess one thing that I've had to kind of backpedal on a little bit with Vikings and Mead is the fact that in Scandinavia, there's not a whole lot of, there aren't a whole lot of bees, basically, if you're talking about way up in the cold north. And that's one thing I'd always said was that Mead, even in the earliest research, I pretty much, Mead was, and wine were basically a luxury. The nobles would drink it. And, people have these images of, Vikings drinking huge horns and tankards full of just this like high alcohol honey-based mead. That would have taken a lot of honey, especially for the huge week-long feasts they would have. So basically what really would have happened is they'd have a big vat of beer going, of ale or grog or whatever you want to call it. And then they might have imported some mead or wine when they were off traveling, doing their raiding and trading and that sort of thing. They might have had a little bit of mead or wine that they managed to make themselves. So, yeah, that's kind of the long and short of it is grains and the ability to grow them and malt them into beer, I think took off. It basically took off when we took off and went from hunter-gatherers to kind of settling down and growing our own grains. And, there's the whole argument amongst, academic types and beer geeks and whatnot as to whether beer or bread came first. And I've done a lot of research into that. And it seems like they kind of came about around the same time, but I get the idea that people, when they were hunting and gathering, they kind of figured out that, when these grains started accidentally molding in the sun, that they could kind of ferment this interesting beverage out of it. And they didn't really need to stay in one place to cook big loaves of bread. And so the theory that I've come to find is the most likely and that I like the best is that, they were like, this stuff's kind of good. We need to settle down and grow a bunch of this grain. And, oh yeah, we can make bread out of it too.
We can scale this as a lovely beverage and also a source of nutrients or something to keep us eating.
Yeah, Egypt and a lot of really ancient cultures, but Egypt specifically, they had some of the biggest commercial breweries that would put to shame, like Budweiser and whatnot. Nowadays, they once their culture developed, they were like, yeah, we're going to make a lot of this stuff.
For the brewing techniques, or actually brewing mead and beer, is the process pretty much similar? If you have a homebrew kit, can you go ahead and make mead, or is the production a little bit different?
The core of the process is pretty much the same. You're fermenting some type of a sugar. Basically, the easy answer to that is if you have a beer kit, you've got everything you need to make mead. If you're just making basic mead and you want to go to beer, depending on how far you want to get into beer, you're probably going to need to buy more equipment. So I like to teach. A lot of my teaching is geared toward not necessarily just beginners, but people who just, my alarm going off here. People who, that's why I kind of resonate with the homesteading sustainability audience. And number one, trying to do everything as DIY and close to home as possible. But also, if you're really busy gardening and farming all day and you want to make some booze, you may not have a lot of time. So basically, I teach basic mead making, which really you can do with just a 1-gallon jug that you can buy at a homebrew store, or just finish off a jug of wine and keep the glass. So really, you don't need much more than a couple basic pieces of equipment that you probably already have in your kitchen. Pot for heating up the water. With beer, there's a lot of heat and cooking involved, especially if you get into all grain, and then you're going to have to like get your malted grains and crush them or buy them crushed. With mead, it's just, you just need to get that honey dissolved and warmed up enough with the water and get some yeast in there. And technically, that's all you need right there. It's just water and honey and some yeast. And then of course, different flavorings. So the process of mead is simple, but making an actual good flavorful mead, especially if you want to age it, that's a lot more about process and time and kind of using the right ratios of ingredients. Kind of, the same goes with beer. You can get away with a few more things with beer, especially if you're making something really hoppy. So those hops can cover up some flavors that might not have, might not have been so good, but if you've got a bunch of hops in, you might not notice them.
Has anyone ever hopped mead, Jereme?
I like to tell people that with mead and with beer, if it's edible, you can put it into it. You may not necessarily want to drink the result, but as long as it's something that's not going to kill you. So there's, I've done some hopped meads, and I've had a few here and there from breweries. The same with cider. The process would be real similar. It's definitely not going to taste the same as, like, say, an IPA, just because the way the hops intermingle with those grains is going to be different than the way they interact with honey or with cider. So, the ones I've had have usually been pretty, even if you put a decent amount of hops in it, they're not real hoppy. You can make session meads, which is one thing I like doing. And those are a lot of the craft meaderies that seem to be doing well. They just make basically 5 or 6% or so alcohol type of a mead that's in a can that you pop it and it fizzes like a cider or a beer. And so there's some meaderies that I've come across that do that, and a lot of them have a hopped mead. And it's a good substitute if somebody needs a gluten-free beer.
Right.
So yeah, short answer, yeah. I mean, you can definitely do it. It's not gonna be the same as what you would have in a beer, but you can get close.
I think I've seen those more so, at least in Southern Ontario, is the meads that are sort of commercially available are those ones that you mentioned, Jereme. Like, they do come in the can. They're in our local liquor store. Maybe they're a little more fizzier than a traditional mead might be. But to what you were saying before, as mead might have traditionally been sort of this maybe luxury type of beverage, I think we're seeing that a little more so now, at least, in our small experience in Southern Ontario. And as an example, I was at a winery about 2 weeks ago who does wine and mead, and had a couple of different meads, which are delicious. Mind you, I don't have too much experience in mead as much as we do beer. Naturally, we're more beer focused, but it was really good and unique and different and more like a sipping product from what I recognized it. But it's cool that it can be, from what how you're explaining, something that's, you can get as detailed as you want it to be and adding a number of different ingredients, but it also could be as basic as you need it to be, which I thought was really cool. And even to that point, I was checking out your website, obviously, prior to speaking with you today. And I love that some of the resources you have on there really break it down in such, like, simplistic terms on how to do all that. I think that's fantastic.
One thing that got me into this was I got a little frustrated with brewing, just trying to really stick to if you do a really methodical kind of brewing, you can make some excellent beer or mead. But a lot of it was, and I came to learn as I was teaching, as I've heard from people who have read the books, that they got frustrated and gave up. And then I was just like, you can make really good mead or beer with these pretty simple. I like to tell people, if you think like a scientist, if you're a very methodical kind of person, then go that route. I'm more of a kind of an abstract, I'm interested in science, but I'm kind of like easily distracted, that sort of thing. But I don't have a lot of time to really delve into it, or a lot of space with the small house with kids. And So yeah, and on your point about, different types of mead. So when I first started drinking mead, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago now, maybe when I had my first mead, the first one I can remember, I thought was kind of awful. And then, over time, I'd find some wineries that would have the high alcohol, really sweet kind of mead that was good to sip on, but you weren't just going to find it just going to your standard beer store. And I like now how there are some meaderies who are making really good high gravity, high alcohol meads, but also more beers or meads for the beer drinkers. Just to let people know it doesn't have to be high alcohol. It doesn't have to be sweet. It can be anywhere from a couple percent to 18% or so, to even blend it with spirits and even higher percent. I mean, it's like any other fermented beverage, like beer. I mean, there can be a ton of different variations, not just in flavor, but in alcohol level, dryness to sweetness. So yeah, but there are only pockets of the US and Canada that I'm aware of, in other countries that are starting to have really popular meaderies. It's probably never get nearly as big as craft beer, but it's growing.
It's nice to have that as extra options. And to your point, if someone is looking for a gluten-free option, which we've actually had requests for on some of our events, it's actually pretty difficult to find, someone brewing a gluten-free beer specifically, but even if it's maybe a similar beverage like a mead, I think that's, there's definitely a use for that, a demand for it.
Jereme, how crazy do recipes go with mead? It seems like craft brewers are now seen as by beer traditionalists as being too extreme by adding strange ingredients, but mead seems to be on like a whole nother level. Reading some of your text about like mushroom and garlic mead and pumpkin mead, and it's just like, how crazy can it get? I know you're more of you seem to be an experimenter by nature, which Garrett and I are as well. Like, how crazy can it go? Can you put anything in mead? There's no rules whatsoever. How far does the experimentation go with mead?
Well, again, if it's something that's gonna hurt you or kill you, don't put it in it. Although historically, we have a pretty strong idea that like the Viking berserkers might have put certain herbs in it that we know now are toxic. They won't necessarily kill you, but they might kind of make you go a little crazy over time if you drink enough of it. So I'm not going to recommend those specifically. But, as far as just, making mead that might make you a little crazy in a good way. So, like I said, it can go anywhere from just a very basic honey water yeast, but then again, there are like a billion different types of honey you can put into it, and that can affect the flavor a lot. But so yeah, as far as how crazy you can go, again, there's melting grains and honey to make braggots. There's, you mentioned mushroom meads and garlic meads and all this kind of stuff, and chili pepper meads. And if you want to get, especially if you're going to make mead for a competition, there's this long list of terms. If it's a fruit mead, it's actually called a melomel. A pepper mead is a capsicumel. So it's a long list. I'm not going to go into all that. I just call it pepper mead or fruit mead. But yeah, you can put, like with peppers, I like to do a sort of a blend where you do just enough of a spicy pepper that you kind of get the blend, the mix of the spice and the sweet. I have overdone that at times, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Same with a garlic mead. A lot of that garlicky flavor can mostly be fermented out, and you don't really get garlic breath when you're drinking. It's more like drinking Chardonnay or something. But some of those I will make very small batches of and use a little bit for cooking. I'll put an actual clove of garlic in a couple of the bottles and take a sip of that, and you're going to get garlic breath. But home brewing, you can kind of afford to do this if you're doing small batches. I'll base meat over, put mead on my meat, kind of use it for cooking, sort of thing. And you can even go as crazy as there's a type of mead that only the the bravest of home mead makers or commercial mead makers have tried, which is a Bochet, Bochet. The history of where that, it's a French word, I believe, but the history of where it actually originated, I've researched a lot and it's hard to figure out. But basically it's caramelized honey. So before you put any water, so when you're making a mead, you're going to dilute that honey with water and then put your other stuff in it. You just take that honey and you just put it over a fire and you just stir like crazy. And once it gets going, it can, you want to use a really big pot because it can quickly foam over. I haven't had this happen, but I hear that same with brewing with extract beer. You get some really hot, sugary malt or honey on your hands. That's not a pleasant burn. So it could potentially be dangerous. It can kind of spurt, out of the pot. But basically, some of the earliest recipe I found is for like a 17th century recipe. And, they basically talk about just keeping it over a fire for like hours, and you have to stir the entire time until it just compresses. And then you've got this really caramelized honey, and you make that into a mead that's got this really interesting caramel, sometimes smoky type of flavor if you've done it over like a smoky fire.
Right.
So that's one where it can get a little crazy. I've done it once over a fire, managed to not burn myself and do anything crazy. I've also done a Bochet that's kind of the cheating method, which I didn't really, a lot of mead making is waiting for this one. It started before I was born. So I came across actually a bunch of big vats of honey that had been in a barn in Ohio. An old beekeeper, I guess somebody bought the property, and I went and did a presentation at a workshop, and they were like, hey, do you want some of this? And I loaded up a bunch. So basically it had been for like 50 or 60 years, or who knows how long.
Oh, wow.
Going through hot summers and cold winters, and it was a really interesting, odd kind of a honey, real dark. So basically it had already been caramelized. Wow. And there's a Dancing Bee winery, which is also a meadery near Austin, Texas, does call it a burn pile Bochet. And he did the same thing. I think they just kind of let it sit out in the Texas sun and let, it's maybe not a full on Bochet, to really do it right, you gotta be a little brave.
Put that elbow grease in over a fire.
Yeah, as far as flavoring, I mean, yeah, you can do pretty much anything edible.
So, you mentioned, there's some meads that you can age, and typically, when, at least when we talk about beer, you obviously can't ferment all beers. So I imagine that might be the same for meads. Is there like some sort of maybe unwritten rule on what type of mead should or shouldn't be aged?
It has mostly to do with the amount of honey. So, for non-brewers, the term gravity, a high gravity mead or beer means a lot of sugars in it. So if you've got a high gravity mead, number one, same with like a beer, like an Imperial IPA or something like that, or a stout. Beer tends to ferment quicker because it's got all those grains, they have all those nutrients that help the yeast along. But, so basically a higher gravity, talking mead specifically, it'll take longer to ferment. And once it does ferment, it may taste pretty good before you bottle it. Sometimes they don't taste all that great at all, but if you age them and forget about them, or try to forget about them, they will improve over time. So that was the mead when I first started learning about mead and making mead, that pretty much everybody thought of it as high gravity wine, like perfectly still. And when a bottle you pull from a wine cellar. And then of course I learned about session meads, also called small meads later, which I always tell people when they ask how long it can take to make mead, technically anywhere from, from making it to drinking it, 1 week to 5 years, depending. So you can make a really low gravity mead with just a couple pounds of honey and drink it, within a couple weeks without even bottling it necessarily. And it's not bad. Sometimes really good. You can bottle it and let it carbonate a little bit. But these higher gravity ones, and they take a little more care too, because mead, I tell people it's when making it, it's like, when you get the yeast starting their job, it's like dropping a bunch of kids into a candy store. The yeast need a lot of nutrients to feed on, or else they get sluggish. They stop fermenting early. They basically get stressed and produce some odd flavors. And so with beer, you don't have that problem because grains and usually a lot of the other ingredients you add are full of nutrients. So with making mead, especially the higher gravity ones, you want to add in some things to kind of basically feed the yeast, which literally are called nutrients. If you just go and buy them at a homebrew store, there's a lot of different types of nutrients.
Okay.
But historically, and even now, you can do so. Like if you're making a mead, a braggot, you don't really need to add nutrients. It doesn't hurt to add some, but it's got all those grains. A lot of the times, the different herbs and stuff you add will help things along. I'll add just a small amount of dried fruit, usually raisins, if I'm not making an actual fruit mead. So you add some different things to keep it going. So yeah, that said, from a high gravity mead, depending on how many nutrients you add and how much you really, because you can kind of get into it. And another thing you can do is there are various methods people have, like online, they get really technical. Do this thing called staggered nutrient addition. You don't add all the honey right off the bat. You add some now, some a little later. You add some nutrients. You get in and you degas it, which is basically stirring it to get kind of CO2 to escape so it ferments quicker. There's all kinds of technical things you can do to speed it up, but when it comes down to it, a couple months to some of my 5-gallon batches I had sitting for close to a year with some of them, and they still hadn't really fully fermented. Like I could bottle them, but those bottles might pop the corks because they would still be
still going.
So yeah, but the higher gravity ones, once you do get them bottled, you do it in a way that they're not going to still be fermenting and pop the corks or have an exploding bottle. Different mead makers will tell you different things. Some say they won't even touch theirs until at least a year. Some say within 6 months. I've had people email me and say, yeah, we made a great mead. We drank half of it over Thanksgiving and then we bottled the rest. And they liked it then and they liked it bottled. So, so there are definitely, some people online, especially, who claim there are these hard and fast rules about it, but really it's up to, I always tell people, if they ask when should I drink it when you like it. If it tastes good when you're getting ready to bottle it, go ahead and have some.
That's a good way.
I'll test mine a couple months into it. With my excuse being, well, let's make sure these aren't going to have popped corks. And sometimes they're not bad. Sometimes they go in, the basement smells like mead, and I see a bottle has popped its cork. And wasn't too long ago, so I take the bottle, I check, and it's good, and I finish the bottle.
Yeah, waste not, want not, of course. So when you're testing some meads, like to sort of see where they're at, are there certain characteristics that you're looking for? Like, I'm sure, like you say, it could be good and you could just have it there and then. But if you were to say, let's say, keep aging it for a little bit, is there something you're looking to maybe show up or disappear or something to that effect?
A lot of times it's to disappear. So like I mentioned, nutrients, and if you don't have enough, that they might develop a bit of an off flavor, sort of a bready, nutty flavor. There's different ways of describing it. Sometimes that will age out. Sometimes I'll try one. Like I actually popped one that's been maybe a year or two the other night, and it was good, but I still tasted a little bit of something that needed to go longer. When I opened one several months ago, I tasted more of that. So it does seem to be aging well. Another way to describe it is just, it might be a little kind of harsh when you first, bottle it, or when you try it after it's been bottled for a little bit. So give it some more time and it'll mellow out. And to be honest, I am not, my wife will tell me this, she often does, I don't have the most sophisticated taste buds. I can taste different beers and meads and catch different things in them. And I'm not I haven't taken any of the classes as far as like, tasting and whatnot, or not, I guess I should say I'm not a, so there's like certified judge type classes you can take and whatnot.
Right.
I'm basically just taking a drink and going, do I like this or do I not? And then I give it a little more time. I set the class down, maybe try it again. And the first drink I may have liked, may not have liked so much. Second time around, I'm like, oh, I like this, but it seems like it's going to need another couple weeks, well, probably a couple months. So yeah, there are definitely some mead makers who will probably give you a lot more of a complicated answer than that, but.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess it could be like we were talking about. It could be, as complicated as you need it to be, and then just kind of go off of what you feel from what it sounds like. Like anything that you look into a little bit further, or maybe you derive a passion from, you could get as technical as right down to the science, and know exactly when you want that mead to be done. But I guess it's all just up to the brewer, I suppose.
Yeah, I mentioned taste buds too. It's not just up to the brewer necessarily, as is also is to the people they share it with. So my wife's taste buds, not only are they supposedly more sophisticated, but she likes things I don't like. And I have other friends who, so I'll try one that I feel like, I'm not a big fan of sour beers. I think if I've had some that I've liked, if it's kind of balanced with other flavors, but I also think my palate just catches all that sour and nothing else. Or kind of same with tart. So like my side meads that kind of turn out a little tartar than I planned on. Some that maybe don't necessarily go sour, but there's a sour edge. I'll take a drink and be like, yeah, I don't know, maybe this will age out, and hand it to my wife, or sometimes a friend who's nearby, and they think it's great.
Right.
So it's like anything too. A lot of it's just different tastes, and then I have some that I try and I'm like, oh man, this one turned out really good. My wife's like, yeah, I don't know about that.
To each their own. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a little frustrating at times because it's a little hard for me to tell like if this is a good mead or not, which is another reason to share it with other people, I guess. And I'm a beer drinker at heart. I got into beer first, so I like mead, but a lot of my beers I can tell pretty quickly. This might, I need a little more hops the next time around, or a little less, or a little more of this type of grain, that type of grain. And I still drink my mead more like a Viking. Yeah, you like it? Yeah, sure.
Well, I was gonna address that too, Jereme. You have a chapter in your first book that I really liked, How to Drink Mead Like a Viking, which kind of goes over some of the traditional contexts, the rituals that are affiliated with mead. Can you touch on that in particular? How would a Viking drink mead? When would he or she do so? What are the particular customs and cultures that's associated with mead in both the Norse traditions, the Anglo-Saxon traditions?
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons why I went into that. First, it's always been a kind of a strong interest of mine anyway. And with the title Make Mead Like a Viking, I wanted to really keep with that theme as much as possible, but also provide, I sections obviously on recipes and that sort of thing. But when I got near the end, it's a fairly thin book, and I felt like I needed a little more. And so I put that together, see what my publishers thought. They loved it and put it in there. Drinking alcohol in general, but mead specifically, or mead/ale as it might have been in Viking times. Number one, obviously you're going to have fun while doing it, or you want to. But secondly, it's historically always been, alcohol has always had this kind of ritual associated with it. So, I kind of talk in the book, part of it is kind of a very serious way of drinking mead, like in the traditional long haul, there'd be a separation of the jarl, the kind of whoever's the noble member of the clan, and the mead hall will be up kind of on their chair, throne, whatever you want to call it. And then there'd be kind of his or warriors, and kind of in the back to be the people just preparing the food and all that. So there'd be this distinction between the different classes essentially. And usually a mead, let's just say a Viking feast would start with sort of that solemn sort of, each different class is given like a certain something to drink, and there's some ritual involved in it. And then once they get that out of the way, then the party starts. So they would, a lot of this, I've learned from reading Icelandic sagas. So there's a huge book, super thick, that, there's all different, smaller books that collect the sagas, but I've got a great big one full of the Icelandic sagas. And they talk about, feasts that would last a week, if not longer. And it has to last that long. If it's over before you tell your guests it's over, and by over means you run out of beer, mead, you run out of booze, that's reflects very badly on your clan, sort of thing. So yeah, I would just, basically you drink all day into the night, pass out, get up, drink, eat some more, and there would be your fair share of fighting and boasts. A big thing was boasts. So, poetry essentially. So it was basically a rap battle. They put together their best rhymes, and those rhymes would involve, like, Beowulf is a good example, where he's telling these stories that are just insane. And there might have very well been people at those parties telling stories like that, and people were like, yeah, whatever, it's not true, but that's a pretty good story. Here's mine. Lots of different types of games. And I mean, I'm sure there were things like axe throwing and that kind of thing, but in addition to poetry and boasting and all that sort of thing, they really liked their strategic games. They were, a lot of people back then, pretty much everybody back then, if you weren't part of some kind of a culture that was involved in a lot of war, then you might not have stuck around for long. So, they would, if I'm saying it right, Hneftal, Hneftal, I think, is sort of, it's basically Viking chess. It's a really old game you can buy. There's lots of modern versions of it you can buy or even make yourself. So basically they would have kind of, strategic table games, and they've even dug up like actual dice made from bones and kind of Viking era graves. So all different types of games and cavorting, and a lot of the times there would be blood involved.
Of course.
Some of the stories I get a little gross in the Icelandic sagas. Sometimes the boasting gets a little out of hand and somebody's arm gets cut off, or there are some where there's a lot of vomit involved, like intentional vomiting on other Viking sort of thing. And so there's and they would have, during the day they would have like wrestling battles or wrestling competitions, and supposedly there's even one where they, a couple of them would get in the water and they would try to drown the other one. Sometimes they would drown the other one.
Wow.
So whoever drowns or gives up is this loser. But a lot of this was just to kind of keep people, especially if these were during the winters. I mean, they need to keep distracted, but they also needed to keep their brains and their bodies kind of sharp and ready to go when it's time to go off a Viking again.
Sounds like a real fun time.
My friend Dave Brown, who I grew up with up the road from my goat farm I grew up on, we were always interested in that idea of a bunch of Vikings cavorting in a mead hall. So he kind of came up with a game I've helped him with called Don't Fall in the Mead Hall. We're basically just a small indie sort of thing where we're trying to get a publisher, but we've been doing it for probably nearly 10 years now, different versions of it.
Oh, cool.
We have a page called Viking Nerds, Facebook. So we share a lot of nerdy Viking stuff, but we also promote the game a little bit.
Right.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, tabletop dice game, bunch of Vikings drinking and boasting in a mead hall sort of thing.
Jereme, do you know, I don't think your book touched on this too much, of how the culture of mead migrated to North America, to the United States. Maybe it did touch on that. I apologize if I missed that section, but do you know how that sort of went about? I mean, Garrett and I were a little bit more familiar of the customs of beer coming to North America.
There's a reason for that. That was one of the things that I did look into that specifically. There's not a lot. Beer really was the thing that kind of, traveled, especially from Europe and Britain. The one thing, as far as the culture of mead, I didn't really find much on actual, I do know that people, probably this wasn't recorded much, but a lot of people would ferment their own mead at home just like they would beer. But one thing, if you look into some old texts, like Thomas Jefferson has some beer recipes, I think, but I think it was Martha Washington who had, some of the older books. I'd have to look one of them up to remember specifically, but I believe she had some mead recipes and ones that had like tons of different herbs in them. So it was definitely being made. It's just as far as the culture, there's almost like this black hole between like Viking times and maybe in the medieval times. And then, like we discussed earlier, it just kind of, at least as far as in the history books, all we really get is just some kind of passing mentions of it. That said, if I get into heavily researching another edition of the book or something like that, I'm not doing anything like that specifically right now. Doing a lot of kind of mental planning for that, but I may very well come across more. I know, especially with beer, even over the past 5 years, so much has been done to kind of debunk a lot of myths and go back to actual primary sources. And so there's a lot more that's out there. A lot of it too that I came across or heard about was in other languages. So, I didn't really have the resources to get a bunch of translations done with the first book. Maybe that'll happen a little better with the second one, or the next one, I should say.
Well, Jereme, I feel burdened in the fact that we've really focused on your one book and not so much on brew beer like Yeti. I think Garrett and I are really more interested in learning a little bit more about mead. It's just a little bit of an alcoholic beverage that we're not so knowledgeable on. So we're taking advantage of speaking to an expert like yourself. Maybe
it pretty much happens every time, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
book is also the most well-known one too. So.
Is that right? Well, we'll have to have you on again to discuss your second book. We are coming close to our hour mark, so we want to be respectful of your time, Jereme. I wanted to get your take on, I see your passions in digging up old sort of ancient forms of brewing and traditions in both mead as well as beer. I see that as quite popular or maybe trendy in this craft beer wave that we're seeing predominantly in North America, but all across the world, sort of this resurrection of different beer recipes that are now almost mainstream. I mean, thinking predominantly of the India Pale Ale, like that wasn't so popular. It was more of an obscure beer style a few decades ago, and now it's pretty mainstream, particularly in craft beer. So why do you think that is? Why do you, being such an individual who's interested in these traditional brewing techniques and these traditional customs and culture, why do we now have this fascination, particularly towards beer and maybe mead? Is that something novel to the 21st century? Is that something we're always, as a civilization, interested in looking back in time? Or is there something particular about our day and age that is so keen and interested in these traditions and customs?
I mean, it is actually something I've noticed and thought about a lot myself. And it's one of those things that my thoughts could really go all over the place on it. But I'll kind of give you the basics of what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking. Like when I first started, the thing that got me going with the book and the traveling and talking about it and everything was I was just blogging about it a little bit, and I thought it was just something me and a couple of my friends were into, and I was just putting the stuff on the internet that nobody was reading, and found out that wasn't true. So I think it's a number of things. It's kind of cyclical. A lot of times in our culture we get to a certain point where we're like, things kind of suck right now. Let's look back to the grand old past when everything was great. Most of us know that it wasn't all that great back then either, but but we're going to look back on the stuff we like. But I think as far as craft beer and the kind of up and coming craft mead movement, a lot of that has to do with, number one, part of that cycle too is things like prohibition. And there have been other periods in the past when, just too much of it was available, or people were just overdoing it too much. And, people were like, okay, we've had enough. Let's just ban it all together. That doesn't work. There seems to be even now a little more, there's kind of a bit of a temperance movement going around, but there's also a lot of people into making low alcohol to no alcohol beers and that sort of thing. So, that's kind of a little bit of a side point there. But that kind of on the point of it being kind of a cyclical kind of thing. Back in my day, when I was first discovering craft beer in like Seattle and the various places I lived around there, when I have gone back to places like that over the past couple of years, I mean, I'm not exaggerating when there's hundreds more breweries in like one area than there, when I was there before, there are maybe a couple. So I think it just, once prohibition ended and then home brewing became legal, which wasn't until like 1978 or so in the United States. And so, those home brewers who had already been doing it could now start selling it. And so, we had that early period of craft brewing when people were just kind of like putting things together and hoping for the best. And then, so that took off, and the real, the true beer geeks discovered all that. And then it's gotten to now where it's just, there's so many more options. And I think, because it's so huge, breweries are having to be like, well, we need to try something different, or we have to do this, hazy IPA. We have to do it hazy on our draft list, or, people might not come here. And then there's also made room for like breweries who are just like, let's screw all that and let's just do this funky, wild stuff. So I think a lot of it is there's such a huge market for about any type of beer or alcoholic beverage really at this point, that it gives brewers more room to experiment. A lot of, there's kind of two classes of drinkers. There's the ones who pretty much always want an IPA or one of the standards, and then they're the ones who are like, what do you have that's different? Where's your sour? Where's your wild? I want to try that. So, when I was first getting into craft beer, if anybody made anything like that, they'd be lucky to, to really sell much of anything. And now there's just so many more people interested. Yeah. So like I said, it's I realize it's getting rather dark in my living room now. It seems still light over there. Mm-hmm. But again, that's one of those things that it's hard to give a reason for. I could go on and on about my theories on it, but a lot of it has to do with just things being cyclical. And with the pandemic and some people actually starting to try to do less alcohol now, it's shifting again. I don't think a ton of breweries have been closing, but they've had to kind of shift gears. A lot of them I'm hearing are going away from the wild and sour, and there are more and more people, myself included, are just like, all right, I just want a good Kolsch. I want a good, British bitter. I'm fine with trying this other stuff, but I want a really well done traditional beer as well. And so the cycle will keep turning, and I'm interested to see what happens next. As long as we don't try and ban it altogether again, that's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. No prohibition number 2, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think that things being cyclical, I think that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Well, Jereme Zimmerman, author of Make Mead Like a Viking and Brew Beer Like a Yeti, a couple of must reads for any brewing fan out there, or just someone who's interested in these traditional forms of alcoholic beverages. Jereme, I think I could speak for Garrett and myself. I think we learned a lot today, particularly about Mead.
Absolutely.
Like I mentioned, we'll have to have you on again to speak a little bit more about your second book, Brew Beer Like a Yeti. But Jereme, thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to speaking again soon.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. And I'd love to talk more about beer or fermentation in general.
Sounds wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jereme. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.